Overall, I wanted to depict an ideal world, which was peaceful with no environmental issues or racism. The relationship between human beings and Pokemon characters is much closer than the owner-pet relationship, which is what I envision to be the ideal relationship. I want everyone to feel something when interacting with this world. In Japan, people sometimes don't give up their seats for the elderly on a train. I wanted to show a world of kindness. It's not just about what's good and what's bad. I wanted to show that there are even better ways to act than normal. For instance, the Pokemon Celebi is said to only appear when you help nature to flourish in a forest in the Pokemon world. Another example I've imagined is despite the normal reputation that electronics like refrigerators and trucks damage the environment or waste energy, these devices would be something closer to nature in the Pokemon world. Junichi Masuda. It's really hard to escape culture, right? We signed a social contract and now there's no way out from it. Thanks, Rousseau. The world around us will always shape us, dear stranger online. We are all too human. We believe in things, we love things, we defend things, and what happens around us leaves a mark in everything we create. And honestly, I think that's beautiful. Ideology, politics, meaning, and intention is what separates content from art. And it's the reason why we connect to art. I have been playing Pokemon for a very long time, and I feel inescapably bound to this series. I am who I am today because of the kid who stood awake through the night playing Pokemon Silver. Someone who learned to see the world through the lens of the Pokemon world. Believing in kindness, community, to take a stand and fight, woke virtue signaling stuff. These are lessons from back then that I'm bound to bring with me for the rest of my life. Art shapes us in the same way that is shaped by society and politics. A few months ago, I had an incredible time writing a video about the influence politics from 90s Japan had in the creation of Pokemon. But there are a few words that you can't really say online without your comment section flooding with all sorts of funny characters, jumping out of every nook and cranny of the internet to accuse me of trying to put politics in a children's game, as if I was the one putting something there, and not the very real people with very real political beliefs who made these games. And even beyond that, as if discussing politics in media made for children was somehow something bad? Not just a Pokemon go to the polls kind of politics, but holding a really open and frank conversation that never really underestimates the intellect of children, as Japanese media often isn't afraid of doing. The work of Hayao Miyazaki immediately comes to mind, a master in the art of creating hauntingly beautiful pieces of film that might be family-oriented, but are never afraid to touch into difficult and important themes. We need to liberate our children from nationalism. The nationalistic view suggests the problems in the world come from its multi-ethnicity. This is a lesson we learned from the past war and which we cannot forget, said Miyazaki in a 2006 press conference. His and Studio Ghibli's work has navigated through topics and showed really explicit imagery surrounding the human cost of war, the dangers of fascism, and the importance of protecting the environment. Environmentalism, bigotry, war, those are all themes that Pokemon, in its own way, also never shied away from. Maybe not as openly as Grave of the Fireflies, but still, the close relationship Game Freak staff and Japanese society have with the horrors of war is something that shows up in their games more often than not. Just as a quick recap in case you didn't watch that video I mentioned, I explored the concept of Pokemon as a very particular product of the zeitgeist of 90s Japan. These kawaii kaiju that were only able to be created because they were part of a certain culture. A culture of a country that was a victim of atomic horror. One of the most cruel fates any people could ever have had. A national trauma that not only killed hundreds of thousands of people, but also created entire generations traumatized by seeing neighbors and friends growing up with the effects of radioactivity in their skin. This was fertile ground for the creation of kaiju media, namely Godzilla, the living embodiment of this radioactive anxiety of fire and destruction that would rampage unstoppable through the streets of Japan. A type of media that made a very strong impression on a young Satoshi Tajiri, a young boy that lived part of his childhood in the city of Nagasaki, just a few years after it was leveled down by an atomic bomb. Growing up there and consuming the art that he did, the kaiju that showed up in the design of Rhydon can be directly linked to the atomic horror of Godzilla, not without being put through a kawaii Japanese international political propaganda machine. These themes are also very explicit in the Generation 3 games, directed by Junichi Masuda. Masuda's Hoenn is based on the real-life Japan region of Kyushu, where the city of Fukuoka is, where his parents were born, and where Masuda speaks of nostalgic summers and kind-hearted people. Fukuoka itself was the original target for one of the atomic bombings, but the US plans changed because of bad weather. Fukuoka, its nature, and its people were saved by the weather, and that's definitely not a theme that shows up in the first games he ever directed in any way, shape, or form. In 2007, in Masuda's own personal blog that is usually reserved for Pokémon stories, the same blog where the Masuda method was first revealed to the world, he wrote the following post. While people all over the world are seeking peace, we also create such weapons. Humans are a strange creature. That is exactly why we must keep on making an appeal, always keep on thinking about it. A weapon that killed 250,000 people. A weapon that killed ordinary citizens. They contaminate the land and the animals with radiation. We need to listen to what people in Hiroshima tell us, what they keep informing us, and learn a lot from them. We Japanese have the opportunity and the power to think about war and nuclear weapons. As the only nation in the world where atomic bombs were dropped, we need to think about them and keep on telling others about them. It's a children's game, Cecily, you're reading too much into it. But why am I revisiting an old video, dear stranger online? Odds are you've seen it already. The thing is, when trying to argue for these very political origins of Pokémon, there was a very common message in the comment section below that you should definitely think about using later, about how environmentalism is the most clear political positioning of the Pokémon series. Pokémon teaches kids the importance of ecology, respecting wildlife, and living a balanced life with nature. And I mean, yeah, right? It's a whole new world we live in, choo-choo-choo-choo, and to be fully honest with you, dear stranger online, I kinda missed going through these old interviews. Today's video is low-key an excuse for me to go through some of my favorite translated Pokémon blogs out there, from Dr. Lava to Junichi Masuda's and Takeshi Shudo's personal columns, because I wanted to better understand the role that environmentalism played in shaping the Pokémon world we know and love today. This one took many hours to get done, and I'm researching, writing, editing, recording for this little channel, all on my own, in my free time from my job, so unfortunately it's hard for me to put out videos as frequently as I would like. If these are conversations you also find interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, do the YouTube thing you usually do, to help me navigate the deep and treacherous waters of this ever-changing algorithm. It would make me super happy. But well, where are the politics of environmentalism in Pokémon? From the creature design in Pokémon itself, like Cursola, as a clear critique on the destruction of coral reefs, Galarian wheezing being a comment on London smog, a very real life-threatening problem until not long ago, and countless other examples, Pokémon isn't really subtle about the political position they are defending. As Masuda said, an ideal, peaceful world where the relationship between human beings and Pokémon, and therefore nature, is as close and pure as it can be. But even though at first glance it's quite obvious that teaching kids the importance of protecting biomes and species is a big goal for Game Freak, I think there is a really big paparaja in the room that kinda doesn't fit with the rest. Something that is such a huge thematic dissonance that it completely breaks my immersion in this world and makes me ask, wait, really? Are you really going with that? It's an uneasiness, an uncomfortable feeling that started in X and Y but got much stronger in Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet. Something that, looking at the main themes of these games and the messaging put through in the early generations, it just doesn't fit. Game Freak, what's the deal with your curries? What am I feeding my Pokémon in these sandwiches? Shigeru Amori, what's in the sausage? What's in the sausage? You might feel like I'm overreacting, but I swear I'm going somewhere with this. Because isn't it a bit weird? The Pokemon world is supposed to be, as Masuda said, an ideal world, right? A place where humans and nature live alongside each other in perfect harmony. It's this magical, socialist, solarpunk utopia, where healthcare is free and universal, there is no social inequality or unemployment, energy is super clean, there's not a clearly defined government, kids go safely on adventures through the world on their own, and money is never an issue. Everyone is welcoming, everyone is kind, and hands you free stuff that you can use for your adventure. Pokemon regions consist of these rural routes connecting towns, cars are almost nowhere to be seen, transportation happens in bikes, trains, and riding on the back of Pokemon. Every city in the Pokemon world is a walkable 15-minute city filled with SJWs with colored hair, and none of these things has ever halted the unbelievable technological progress in this science-led society. The world is this rural, nostalgic countryside absolutely unspoiled by Japanese industry and neoliberalism, where it's absolutely possible that nature and clean energy-based witchcraft technology can exist side by side. Where the dystopian doom of cyberpunk might have displayed the anxieties of a nation oppressed under ultra-liberal capitalism in the 90s, the solarpunk Pokemon world allows children to dream of a sustainable future side to side with nature. For example, Junichi Masuda speaks about the implementation of the berry planting mechanic back in Gen 3 as something that is thematically designed to teach kids about managing natural resources. A kid playing through the game will learn quickly that if you take the berries out of the ground and not plant them back, soon you won't have berries anymore. When you find a berry tree, you are given 2 of them. If you use both straight away, that's it. They won't spawn ever again. But if you use one and plant the other, soon players will see themselves with an unlimited amount of these items that are incredibly important for battles or to evolve your Phoebas into a Milotic. If you give resources back to the land, back to nature, and nurture them, you will always have a sustainable supply. And kids really understand that, and it reminds me of the viral Reddit post where a kid, after reading in the Pokédex that Lapras was an endangered species, bred and released dozens of them back to the wild, which is the sweetest story ever. Gen 3 and Junichi Masuda is when I would argue that environmental messaging was at the forefront of Pokemon. As it was masterfully discussed in Tamahiro's incredible Ruby and Sapphire review, the plot of these games are shaped by the very real political conflict of the Izahaya Bay Land Reclamation Project that has been dragging since the 80s in Japan. I will summarize it here since it's so well detailed in Tama's channel, and if you're interested, you should definitely check it out. But Izahaya Bay is, well, a bay in Kyushu Island, as I said before, the real-life inspiration for the Hoenn region. The country of Japan, just like Hoenn, has too much water in it, so a lot of urban development projects in Japan actually consist in creating more land to make space for things like airports, housing, and farming. Izahaya Bay specifically has been making headlines for over 30 years, mainly about the environmental concerns about this land reclamation project and its impacts on marine life and fishermen's livelihoods. According to Nippon.com, farmers began tiling their new plots in 2008, but doing so required the construction of a 7-kilometer-long dike across the bay that continues to choke off what is left of one of Japan's largest and most vibrant wetlands. Individuals involved in fishing and nori farming around the Ariake Sea have maintained fierce opposition to the dike, claiming the disruption it causes to currents had reduced catches and hindered seaweed production. This complex political conflict of interests, where farmers and fishermen livelihoods were at stake, was translated into Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire as Team Magma and Team Aqua, 2 opposing teams with diverging goals in a child-friendly introduction to how complicated real-world politics can be when 2 sides have conflicting needs for their survival. In the games, both Archie and Maxie see the errors of their ways after an angry dragon comes down the sky. In real life, Japanese Supreme Court sided with the farmers. Masuda was really keen on introducing critical thinking and important political issues in a kid-friendly way through his games. In one blog post, he speaks about his choice to hide the Regis between a Braille puzzle, because I thought it would be nice if lots of people who play Pokemon would become a little bit more familiar with Braille, even without knowing it. A society where you can work and play together with other people, no matter who they are. For us, such an ideal world forms a foundation for Pokemon games. In another post, he describes the choice to title the first Pokémon remake internationally as Leaf Green instead of Water Blue is that the leaf is a symbol of peace, while fire and water are opposing concepts, so it seems like a conflict. In our world of conflicts, Junichi Masuda wanted to choose a name that was suggestive of a peaceful world. But not only that, Pokémon also uses storytelling to introduce kids to other more complex real-world issues. With Pokémon X and Y, Lysandre manipulates media and has his Ubermenschen army wanting to literally purge the world of anyone who doesn't fit in their pretty ethno-state. A subtle reference to a real-life Austrian painter that had some similar ideas. But there are also topics such as in Black and White, where Team Plasma's goal of separating Pokémon from humans to protect them from abuse echoes really important conversations about the treatment of animals and addresses a common critique that is presented to the franchise. And unfortunately, instead of being developed, it reaches a Marvel villain twist, invalidating an interesting argument because their methods are questionable and Ghetsis is a psychopath. It's toned down when compared to Ghibli and really simplified for a young audience, but it's undeniably a political messaging that the creators are intentionally putting there, knowing that kids from all over the world will be eagerly listening. As Tara said, Game Freak had a megaphone in their hands and felt like they had the responsibility of teaching new generations not to repeat the mistakes of the past, not to repeat war, not to repeat atomic horror, and at the forefront, to protect our future by respecting and protecting nature. That's the briefing, right? That's what the Pokémon world on paper is. An ideal world, a peaceful world where nature and technology coexist, where these incredible creatures are more than your pets, they're your friends. Some of them work alongside you, some of them have a higher intellect than humans. They communicate, they dream, they feel, they form their own societies, and they enjoy competing against each other for sport. A Pokémon that is caught is choosing and consenting to join you, and that is the official explanation for why a legendary Pokémon that can bend space and time would chill with a 10-year-old. You need to first prove yourself worthy before Arceus would lend a piece, an image of themselves, to you. Pokémon are complex beings with the same comprehension of the world that a human has. Which brings me back to the question, what are the sausages made of? And here I want to say this video is not about real-world veganism and the impact individual diets have on real-world systems and environments, even though I do have personal opinions on that. I am myself vegetarian, and I think that might have been the trigger for my initial discomfort, but that's not what the point of this video is. What I'm really trying to explore here is that, for the Pokémon world, the thematic dissonance between this really clear environmental political flag that Game Freak has repeatedly defended, and the idea of Pokémon as the ideal partner, and the choice to add some mechanics to later games is something that caused me some discomfort, and just feels really off somehow. First of all, I want to clarify that there are no animals in the Pokémon world. It seems obvious, but early in the creation of Pokémon, some concepts were a little bit flaky, and there weren't really any rules, so you will sometimes see real-life animals popping out here and there in the early anime seasons, and things like real-world places being referenced here and there, like an Indian elephant, the United States of America, and Mew being found having an acai bowl in the outskirts of Santarém. It is really probable that the war Lieutenant Surge references in Generation 1 is just World War II, because back then there wasn't a clear separation between our worlds and the world of the games. Kanto was in Japan, and these rules were only set in stone later, as explained by anime head writer Takeshi Shuro. In the world of Pokémon, only Pokémon appear. However, unfortunately, there are times when things that look exactly like real animals appear on the screen, but I would like you to think that they are Pokémon that look exactly like the real thing. In reality, it is a mistake on the part of the artist, which is also why you get some things in the early anime seasons like Ash and Brock drooling over a cooked Magikarp. Something that I will ignore for the purpose of this video because there were not a lot of defined world building rules back then. To talk about food in the Pokémon world, I will try to focus more on canonical facts and gameplay mechanics, while ignoring things like Pokédex entries because, come on, Macargo is not hotter than the surface of the sun. From the second generation onward, the rules around food in the Pokémon world become much more consistent. Pokémon are only seen eating generic specialized meals, and humans will be eating things like donuts, Berries, puffins, Pokeblocks, Pokepuffs, and Pokebeans. Food in early Pokemon has always been completely vegan. In Gold, Silver, and Crystal, in the first plot point that functions to establish Team Rocket as villains, they kidnap Azalea Town's entire population of Slowpokes to sell their tails as food. This is framed as something extremely evil by the games, dangerous to the health of the Slowpokes, and something that you, the protagonist, must stop at any cost. A decade later comes Pokémon X and Y and the fancy restaurants of Lumio City. Suddenly you, the player, who was stopping Team Rocket from mutilating these poor creatures out of their tails, was chilling out in bougie Michelin restaurants being served exactly Slowpoketails. It's fine now, no biggie. And not only Slowpoketails, but Lumio's was also feeding the players roasts and fried fish. And again, there are no animals in the Pokemon world, so... And you can see that they are uncomfortable with it too. They don't say it's a love disc or a Magikarp. They write fish as in generic fish. And you might think I'm overreacting a little bit here that Pokemon as a game already has some really shady morals. We are raising animals to battle, and of course, it's a game with a breeding mechanic that results in genetic selection, forcing a single Pokemon to breed hundreds of times to find one with your desired nature and IVs. And the food is what annoys me? And I get that. And that is all really based in a suspension of disbelief. We all sign a contract when playing these games. I will accept to believe in what the game tells me based on the framework of rules the game has provided me. I will accept that breeding as a mechanic isn't really supposed to be used as a genetic selection experiment in a casual playthrough of a Pokemon game. I will accept that Pokemon enjoy battling out of sport. But when you create a world inhabited by these creatures who have human conscience, a game that is supposedly standing up for a certain political messaging, as Masuda said, an ideal world where the relationship between human beings and Pokemon characters is much closer than the owner-pet relationship. But somehow, it's okay to just eat some of them? It's something that breaks immersion completely. And from X and Y onwards, it only gets worse. In Sword and Shield, there is the new mechanic of curries. Some of the ingredients include burgers, sausages, bones, and Slowpoketails. In Scarlet and Violet, the sandwich mechanic is essential for shiny hunters. Still, sandwich ingredients include bacon, ham, prosciutto, chorizo, sausages, hamburgers, smoked fillets, and cloth sticks. In restaurants all over Paldea, you can eat cloth al ajillo, ceviche, smoked filet with herbs, sushi, and pickled Toedscool. And I mean, why? Really, why? The usual answer is that things like Cloth's claws and Slowpoketails are removed painlessly and grow back really fast, which kind of renders the Team Rocket's Johto subplot kind of senseless. When a journalist from Kotaku asked Junichi Masuda in 2018 what kind of meat people in the Pokemon universe eat, he laughed and said, "I'm actually curious about that as well." And I'm like, Junichi, for Christ's sake. I'm sure this was brought up in a briefing meeting when discussing game mechanics. It was a direct choice to add these products to the games, and my question is, why do we need it? Why can't we just use the other dozens of ingredients that are not animal products, like tofu, noodles, and rice? Is that such a difficult position to take in the game you're using to teach children about the importance of respecting the environment? Where you are trying to create an ideal world? And I think this has a lot to do with Japanese culture and how big animal product consumption is in Japan. As it is the case with many islands, Japanese food culture is very centered around the sea. Not only through fish and sushi, but also in the prevalence of the dashi broth in many recipes and in the consumption of other controversial dishes, such as whale meat. I've heard from people who visited Japan that it's virtually impossible to get vegan or vegetarian dishes in most restaurants, with Japan being named one of the worst countries to eat in the world for vegetarians and vegans. But it also strikes me as another symptom of a very liberal approach that Pokemon has to the environmentalist flag that it claims to hold. In their blog called Edge Effects, Nate Carlin says that catching them all is a Victorian naturalist dream job, and I have been thinking a lot about that. Nate writes that trainers must collect a finite list of species in an ecosystem, report back to your research institution, and be rewarded for a job well done. Here, I use the term ecosystem very loosely. There is no sense of food webs in Pokemon games, and predation is more alluded to than explicit, but there is a staggering number of Pokemon to collect. It's a perfect world for the collector. A John James Audubon or a Henry Walter Bates would have a field day. Once again, the design nature of Pokémon fulfills the desires of its human players by turning the world into an untroubling and simplified echo playground. Game Freak seems comfortable enough to ask questions of war, of supremacy, of the very relationship between trainer and Pokémon as a relation of submission, but seems a bit afraid to tackle other subjects that are also extremely important for the real-world conversations we are having today about environmentalism. Avoiding questions about where food comes from, adding unspecified meat, and avoiding to add, fish, because you would have to model the fish into the sandwich, and then you would have to choose a Pokemon fish. You get it. And then their explanation is just, don't think too hard about it. You could do complicated mental gymnastics to explain what's in the sausage. Or you can also, just not have the sausage. Do you really expect a kid to not ask these kinds of questions? And I think this is the limit to my suspension of disbelief. I'm not even here holding the sign for a vegan Pokemon game. With the Pokemon world being again this solarpunk utopia, I can completely buy the narrative that cheese and moo milk production is completely ethical and an essential part to the culture of this fictional world, as we see with the Moo Farm subplot in Johto. But why do we really need to have these ingredients, these dishes, when all it does is to make people ask awkward questions and feel uncomfortable with the idea of eating their ideal friends? Because I understand the importance of alluding to food chains in the ecosystem, teaching kids about those, I really do. But at the same time, I fully believe that humans in a solarpunk utopia, in an ideal world, can and should just be vegetarian. And again, dear stranger online, this isn't a video about ethics of real-world veganism. I understand that in society, people from different places and different cultures have their individualities, and not everyone can afford the privilege of having a restrictive diet. But Pokémon is standing on two foundations: the importance of preserving the environment, and the trainer-Pokémon relationship as a strong, deep, and ideal connection. A franchise that, depicting the world that they do, could just make the really easy choice to create a world without the consumption of animal products, and still choose not to. Even though industrial farming and consumption of animal-based products is an environmental issue, agribusiness is directly linked to land degradation, climate change, air pollution, water shortages, and the loss of biodiversity. Even though most industrial cattle farming is extremely anti-ethical from an animal rights perspective. And when we translate that to the Pokemon world, it's that same uneasiness when a kid learns for the first time that some cultures are comfortable with eating animals we see as pets. At the end of the day, the Pokemon world is a reflection of what our world should strive to be. A utopia, a mirror of possibility. It's the coexistence of scientific progress, universal healthcare for all, and the preservation of the environment. A world where people are kind to foreigners, where strangers exchange gifts and hand you important items for your journey, where you give up a seat to the elderly on a train, where people are kind. And I believe this should also be a world where the choice to not consume animal-based products is a really easy one to make. The real world is complicated and culturally complex and ugly, and sometimes difficult choices between starvation and speciesism need to be made. That is a real world issue, that is a political question, and that is something that needs to be discussed with kids. But an ideal world? A world of coexistence, a solarpunk utopia, a glimpse of what perfect coexistence between people and nature could be, doesn't need sausages and prosciutto. I have a close friend that has been vegan for well over a decade now. And I remember when Pokemon Go came out, it was all I talked about with everyone. I told her, if Pokemon were real, I would have become vegetarian a long time ago. And she looked at me a bit disconcerted and said, "Do you know what is real? Animals." And that was a conversation that really stuck with me for a long time. Until I finally made the decision myself to cut down my animal product consumption. A decision that was both based on disapproving the agricultural practices in my home country, but also supported by the privileges of having easy access to nutritious and delicious vegetarian food where I live. And who knows, also maybe because I was a kid who played too much Pokemon. And you know what? I think Game Freak was really successful in teaching kids like me about nature, about the importance of preservation, nurturing, and sustainability. And the last thing I'd want to do is to project my own ethical perceptions into a Japanese product, part of a culture that isn't mine. And maybe it's not even that big of a deal. And again, I just wanted to use this video as an opportunity to dive deeper into this relationship between Game Freak, the artists behind the game we love, and what they believe about environmentalism. We're just rehearsing, right? And I don't know, this one thing specifically stuck out to me. And maybe for you it's fine, and it's just a children's game, and I'm reading too much into it, but I don't know, it feels off. Pokemon taught me to cherish nature as a partner, as a close friend. Politics shapes art, and art shapes our political view of the world. Pokemon is a series that I consumed intensely as a kid, and taught me many, many important lessons. I just think it would make me happy if the Pokemon world learned some of those lessons too.